Hello, my name is Curtis Lockhart. I'm a researcher here at the Charter Cities Institute. Welcome to CCI's Q&A video series where we speak with researchers, academics, and practitioners who share their work about everything from charter cities to urban planning to innovative governance and many, many more topics. Today, I'm joined by Katarzyna Nawrot and James Donald. Kat is a European young leader and the author of the book, The Rise of Megacities. She was a research fellow at the Graduate Institute of International Development Studies in Geneva and at the Harvard Kennedy School of Government. James is the CEO of Tomorrow Trust, a South African nonprofit that uses innovative education models to unlock the potential of marginalized kids in South Africa. James was also a Harvard South Africa Fellow and Mason Fellow at the Harvard Kennedy School back in 2017, and after that consulted for the African Leadership University. So hello, Kat and James. Thanks so much for joining me today.
Thank you. Thanks for having us.
Yes, good morning.
Great. So as these typically go, Kat and James, they have a 15 to 20 minute slide presentation on their paper, African Megacities as Emerging Innovation Ecosystems. So I'll let them start to get the presentation ready to go. And then after the slides, we'll have a brief Q&A with me asking Kat and James some questions, and we'll end by letting folks know where they can go if they'd like to learn a little more or have any further questions for James or Kat about their research. With that, I shall pass it over to Kat and James. And before maybe you guys start the slides, it'd be good if you give a brief intro to yourselves, your background, and your work. Yeah, other than that, take it away when you're ready.
Okay, so good morning, Curtis, and good afternoon, James, and hello, everyone. And thank you so much for having us today. It's really great that we can share some of our research on cities and megacities, and especially on Africa. So I'm in academia. I'm a researcher and scientist, and mainly in development economics, and currently a member of Committee of Future Studies Poland 2000+. And before James starts to share some of our main findings, I would like to share with you how the whole idea of studying megacities started. Actually, it was initiated by Polish Academy of Sciences, by the Committee of Future Studies Poland 2000+. The committee, co-led at that time by Professor Jerzy Kler, identified megacities as areas of a great interest and areas which really need to be studied. And so we were doing that time a big project, Global Threats as Barriers to Development, together with National Bureau of Security and under the patronage of the President of Poland. So we've done a lot of research on megacities from all possible angles, including the public health. The very first results, they were presented in 2014 during the conference here in Poland. And a year later, the first book on megacities appeared. It was entitled Megacities of the Future. And with the ongoing research, we actually came to the understanding how important this topic was, and we decided to reach for broader audience, but also for researchers from all corners of the globe. So that's how we started to cooperate with international experts from China, from Bangladesh, from India, from Africa, from Europe, and from the America. And I was very happy to work on the African chapter with James here. And I think we were both really honored to work together with Professor Katarzyna Juma of Harvard Kennedy School. And I have to tell you that Katarzyna was extremely excited about this project. I'm sad to share that he passed away 2 years ago after we finished, but before the book was released. So I would like to give you here just a few slides on the background why we were interested in African megacities and cities. And I would like to highlight just two aspects. So the first one, it is the population. So if you look at this graph here, it shows the world population from 1950 till the end of the century. And it shows the world, Asia and Africa. So what has happened, it is that from 1950 till 2015, basically the biggest increase in population we saw in Asia, mainly China, India, and other countries in the region. However, according to the predictions, and here there are data based on United Nations and medium variant projections. What we can see, it is that the biggest increase in population will happen in Africa. So it will double by the mid of the century and then increase even more. And what we can expect is that by the end of the century, around 40% of population will be living in Africa and around 43% in Asia. So this is a huge reshuffling of division of population worldwide. And the second aspect, it is urbanization. So again, according to the predictions, the world urbanization of 21st century will be led by Africa. So it is projected, here we have the world population, world urbanization, and for Africa, still more people live in rural areas than in urban areas. And it is projected that it will equal around 2040. So then there will be more urban residents than rural residents. And by the end of the century, it will be around 80% of people in Africa living in urban areas. So what does it mean for our studies? I would say we can draw two conclusions. First, it will mean the rise of cities and megacities. And second, it will increase the population in the existing cities and megacities. And here on this figure, there are just projected megacities in Africa in 2015 and 2030. So what you can see from this graph, there are the beginning of the vector, it is the population in 2015. And the end of the vector, it is the population in 2030. And then on the other side, we can see the mean rate of growth population. And the beginning of the vector, it is the average rate of growth population from 1950 to 2015. And the end of the vector, it is the average rate of growth population for 2015-2030. And very brief, what you see, it's long arrows, right? And what does it mean? It means that the population in African cities in a relatively very short period of time might double, triple, or increase even more. And on the next slide, you can see this from the different perspectives. We call it, we put it into a model with Professor Jerzy Kler, and we call it galloping model of megacities rise. And what does it mean? It means that those cities will be characterized by really amazing high rate of growth population, by chaotic urbanization, and unfortunately by negative externalities. And those negative externalities, it could be seen not only in Africa, but globally. So this is something crucial. And this kind of amazing growth has not been seen even in other parts of the world, like in South Asia or in China. Even if you look at Shenzhen, on the next slide, you have the Chinese city. And if you look at the megacities in high-income countries, this rate of growth population over 65 years was below 1% or 2%. And you can see it on the next slide when you look at the Paris, London, or New York. So this is something which has not happened. And this is what pushed us into our research with a question whether African megacities can emerge as innovation ecosystem. So I think I stop here and give it over to James. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Kat and Curtis, for having us. Yeah, so there's a lot to tell in 10 minutes. I think people are excited about the potential for cities, but I think the story that Kat just explained, there are both huge opportunities there, and a lot of it, to be frank, is quite frightening. In Africa, the cities that Kat spoke about, the vast majority of large African cities, so that's million people or more, are likely to double by 2030. Kat's an economist, so she'll be more specific, but I've looked at the figures and I'm quite comfortable with that. That means any large city in Africa will double its population by 2030. If you take North and South Africa, so countries like Algeria, Morocco, and South Africa out of the equation, African cities are already 80% slums or informal. So if you imagine that over the next 20 years, those cities are going to double, it's quite apparent that in a way the cities are building themselves. They're having to be organized and literally built by hand by the inhabitants that live in them. So the cities of the future, we tend to think of even the industrial or the central business districts of places like Johannesburg or Lagos or Nairobi. But really you have this huge amount of people moving to the cities, and at the same time you don't have this rapid rate of industrialization that you had, or at least not projected to have, that you had in Asian cities and definitely in European cities. So I thought I'd just share a bit of the kind of story of Johannesburg to help show you some of the things that we learned, and a slightly different way of thinking about things. So these slides that Kat put together for us a few years ago, just show that the African story is positive in terms of economic growth, right? We've had really significant economic growth in African countries over the last 10 years. And in places like South Africa, South Africa's average GDP growth has been something like 2% on average over the last 10 years. But cities like Johannesburg have averaged something like 7%. So cities themselves are definitely engines of growth, like we know that. But trying to understand why they are engines of growth, I think, is sometimes very useful. But you also see how, even while the populations are exploding, you can see how Africa's GDP growth has not tracked that, at least not yet. Before I get into Johannesburg specifically, this slide might be interesting to the more technical amongst you. And actually, the COVID outbreak made me think about it a lot. I mean, if you look at that map and you think about the way COVID spread from China across Africa. So this is a map of foreign direct investments from cities to cities. So Professor War at University of Witwatersrand and also at, I think, Rotterdam University, he studies the microeconomics of competitiveness. And what's really interesting about this is he shows how isolated African cities are from, purely the measure of foreign direct investment. And he added even to that fact that foreign direct investment into African cities is almost always intercompany transfers. In other words, it's multinationals investing in themselves. So it's not this massive flow of money coming into cities that you see in European, Chinese, and American cities. So another example about that is people talk about the rise of other economic hubs. So Johannesburg averages about $1 billion a year in foreign direct investment. And like I said, that grows at quite a significant rate. The only other African city close to that is Cairo, but growth there is relatively flat. Cape Town is about half that, about $500 million a year, but growing relatively fast. And then it falls quite quickly to Nairobi and Lagos. So if you just look at these cities growing, it's not like there's this massive flow of capital to build the infrastructure in those cities, at the same time. This is Johannesburg's sort of GDP based on different financial sectors. So you can see a story that I think is told around the world, where you have relatively rapid growth in things like finance, transport and trade, but manufacturing, mining, agriculture, a lot of the core drivers of African economies have been flat in Johannesburg and remain flat. So just to the storytelling part, and I don't want to give a history lesson, but I think this conference was originally going to be in Johannesburg, so this part might not have been necessary. But Johannesburg is, by many measures, what they call the most isolated of the world's global cities. So that's both in terms of finances, as I showed you in that previous map, and also where it is. It's more or less where my cursor is. It's the largest city in the world that's not built on the ocean or on a navigable river. The city itself is about 4 million people, but what they now call the Gauteng city region, so that's the cities that are connected to it, are about 12 million people in the region around that. And I just want to talk a little bit about innovation. Professor Calestis Juma, who I got to know when I was at the Kennedy School, was an African academic. He worked for the Kennedy School, and he also was a chair of the innovation sort of committee on the African Union. And one of the big arguments that he made around economic development is that people talk about capital, labor, and investment. And if you look at the examples of economists like Schumpeter, who spoke really strongly about the data of his research, which was 50 or 60 years ago now, that those components, capital, labor, productivity, those components alone didn't seem to account for the huge economic growth that was seen, in the developed world over the 100 years preceding that. And he argued that the missing piece was innovation, basically a realignment of local capabilities with new technologies. And that was a very big factor in driving growth. So this is an aerial shot of Johannesburg. So as I said, the city more or less that I'm showing you is about 4 million people. The greater area is around 12 million people, but very spread out. So the Gauteng city region, as they call it, is about the same size in population as the greater London area, but it's on more than 3 times the land area. So lots of inefficiencies in the distance. If you see down the bottom, that's a ridge of the old original gold mines. So gold was discovered there in the late 1880s along this ridge. And something like 80% of the gold that is currently out of the ground in the world either came out from underneath Johannesburg or financed by the mining houses that got it out of the reef further to the west and the east of this. Now that gold would make a ball that you could fit, inside a basketball arena. It wouldn't be particularly big. Gold itself is not, particularly useful. And the gold alone, I think, is worth something like $3 trillion. However, the economic activity that developed in order to get that gold out built a megacity, right? That 100 years ago, there was almost no economic activity in this area. When the British fought the Boer War and took over control of the territory that's now Johannesburg, they estimated that there was something like 10,000 working age men in the area. And within 10 years, it was a city of 100,000 people. Now, the fascinating thing about Johannesburg, if you look at this innovation lens and what the paper argues, is that Johannesburg has gone through 2 very fast transformations, and it's about to go through a 3rd one, all of them driven by changes in innovation. So everyone gets very excited about the conversation around the 4th Industrial Revolution. But if you look at cities, in particular a city like Johannesburg, you can see that play out. So in the 2nd Industrial Revolution, so basically around the process of mechanizing, putting in electricity, getting that gold out of the ground, in a period of around 80 years, from 1890 to about 1950. In 1890, there was no city there. By 1950, it was one of the largest sort of economic hubs in the world. And that population and economy then doubled in both size and value again in the next 30 years. So from the 1950s to like the early 1980s, driven then by communication and banking sectors, the economy grew again. And at each stage of that, the city completely transformed itself. And of course, South Africa had the added disadvantage of an apartheid system that built a lot of inequalities and inefficiencies into it from the beginning. So I wanted to show you a little bit of what that actually looks like. So this is what the area around Johannesburg looks like. And this is Soweto. Many of you have heard of Soweto, a large southwestern township in Johannesburg. If you look on the top left, you can see the leftovers of old mine dumps. So you can see water reservoirs. And then you can see neighborhoods that have built up post-1994. So these are government-funded or bank-subsidized or bonded houses. But you can see how these neighborhoods are built quite literally in the middle of nowhere, not connected to any industry, can't see any factories, not connected to any city. They're sort of neighborhoods on their own that were built purely to try to catch up the backlog after apartheid. Now, this is a photograph of Johannesburg itself, facing north. And look at the difference just in the amount of trees. The other interesting fact is that Johannesburg is the world's largest man-made forest. And the trees were planted for wealthy neighborhoods. But the actual environment of the area has changed. I mean, those look like two entirely different parts of the country, but they're a 15-minute drive from each other because of what happened in 70 years of development. And then just with the last few minutes, I think I've got about 5 minutes left. I just want to show you a few more things around innovation. So this is, all these photos I want to show you now at more or less the same scale. So this is Cambridge, Boston and Massachusetts. So this is famous for some of the most innovative, pieces of land in the world, rich in universities, hospitals, and just look at the kind of density between the houses, cars, and just imagine all the relationships, design, research, discussions, education happening in those spaces. This is, at the same scale, a photograph of Sandton, which is the wealthiest square mile in Johannesburg. So this is a central business district where Johannesburg Security Exchange is, etc. So a very similar scale. I mean, it could be a similar kind of city. So potentially also the kind of place that would harbor the same kinds of innovation. Now, just this frame is sort of less than a kilometer to the east. So what apartheid did is it divided areas by race. So what you see here is very careful apartheid planning in the 70s. There was a neighborhood that developed before the big racial segregation processes called Alexandra. And it's one of the very few predominantly black neighborhoods that existed close to economic activity throughout apartheid. So first they separated it by a big piece of greenbelt, public space. Then they separated it by light industry. And then basically they reshaped that part of the town so it was easy to lock down. So on the right-hand side, those are houses, one of the most densely populated parts of Johannesburg. And it's the same picture, they're at the same scale. But you wouldn't imagine that is the same picture as that. So this is now zooming out. So this is Alexander in the middle. Up front, you can see how that green belt grows, and you can see where the city that was invested. And it was around this space that we wrote the paper, trying to understand how can the city of Johannesburg think of innovation and create an ecosystem or leverage an ecosystem that already exists to promote innovation in order to have more equitable growth. So Johannesburg has a GDP per capita of around $8,000, which is good. I mean, it's upper middle income. Yet it has a Gini coefficient of like 0.66, 25% people live in poverty, and it has optimistically 30% unemployment, partly because of the geographic spreads. So this last map here is just a kind of more physical example of that. And I've chosen one piece to talk about innovation. There are lots of other ways you can think about it. I'm talking about space, about how people are connected. But Johannesburg is inverted to like the American idea of a city, right? So you have 3% of the metropolitan area has 1/3 of the jobs. So those are the areas that are kind of dark red. So that's density of employment within those areas, right? 5% of the metropolitan area has 1/3 of the inhabitants. So the dark spotted areas, these are the most densely populated parts of the city. So you can see you have huge populations of informal economy, low investment, low infrastructure, disconnected. And the city's been spending a lot of time and money and effort on trying to improve transport and other things, and then trying to promote informal economies in those areas, where they started. So just to wrap up, I mean, that can be a little bit overwhelming. So what does an innovation ecosystem really mean? And so here's just a bit of a more specific example. So let's take one sector like software, just to wrap up. So there actually aren't any software exporting countries that didn't also have quite significant microchip or what's the right word, sectors that exported technology in the 80s as well. So places like Singapore, Taiwan, etc. The only real examples of countries that have big software exporting sectors without having had that level of technology before them are places like Ireland, and then places like Israel and the US, who have significant government investments. But South Africa, strangely enough, actually has a really significant software exporting industry that's mostly developed around the financial sector. And a few strange spin-offs have happened from that. So for example, something like 80% of all BMW's IT work and infrastructure is done in Johannesburg. So that includes all the online systems for the new mega factories in China. It includes the remapping of the buttons in your BMW X5. And that happened because there is a BMW factory in Johannesburg. 4 or 5 years ago, they started using local SAP consultants to help rewire the map, to redesign the factory. And then they realized that there was such capacity in the local system that within no time at all, they found it was more efficient to actually develop all the SAP work from South Africa. And then now more than 2,000, that hub employs more than 2,000 software developers. So here's an example of how you could use an innovation ecosystem to promote one sector. So in this one, it's now software. So we spoke about trying to look at existing capacity. In South Africa, there's a software engineering center attached to the university. So an example would be to actually give that institute resources from government resources to be part of the innovation ecosystem formally, instead of just talking about it from the outside. We spoke about potentially working with the different provincial governments to create a software innovation plan for the city. And then that could then include some very specific solutions. So for example, it's very hard for expatriates to work in South Africa, but the cost of living is much cheaper than places like Boston or Singapore or Toronto. So there'd be a lot of interest in people living in Johannesburg. And then places like Bangalore have a large talent pool, and Johannesburg has a software talent shortage. But it's very difficult for those two places to connect. And then we spoke about developing a cluster mapping system in Johannesburg to track the size of the industry. So you're giving data to all the players and actually seeing what's happening. And so that innovation works, when it's sort of exposed to the light and you can see what's happening. Using local procurement capacity for the city. So abilities to lower costs, improve bandwidth, that kind of stuff. Improve digital government services with horizontal learning capabilities. So that's what's interesting about innovation. Places like Germany spend a lot of money and time and effort on horizontal learning. In other words, there's a whole sector around, improving the quality of the door hinge. And there will be, conferences and discussions around that specific thing. South Africa needs to do something similar, and in Johannesburg you could do that. Innovation competitions, and then discussions around economic zones, etc., make them very public and integrate them, and then consider using things like public-private partnerships to actually promote innovation. So I hope that gives you a little bit of, from the very high level, right down to some of the more practical policy ideas, how looking through things as through the eyes of innovation can be helpful.
Yeah, great. Thank you so much, both. That was a great presentation. The paper was really interesting, and I'm sure, Kat, the book adds a lot more on top of the paper as well. So yeah, now I just let's transition over to the Q&A part of the webinar. So first, you guys kind of alluded to in the paper, and James talked a bit with Johannesburg, the case study he went over in the presentation. There's a kind of difference between catch-up growth, right, and growth at the technology frontier. So when East Asia started on their pretty amazing record of economic growth since the 1960s, they first started out just doing catch-up growth, kind of finding a niche, typically low-skilled, labor-intensive manufacturing like textiles, and then they slowly work their way up the value chain over decades, and only eventually do you get, for example, a Samsung in South Korea innovating at the technology frontier. So I guess my question is, why shouldn't Sub-Saharan Africa follow this East Asian path and just focus right now on catch-up growth, and only once that catch-up growth is kind of firmly entrenched, then try and roll the dice and place big bets on more risky and innovative growth at the technology frontier?
Yeah, I can. I mean, Professor Gemma, who those of you who didn't follow his stuff, I think you would find his sort of way of writing about these issues really accessible. But he would argue that leapfrog is possible in very certain circumstances. So the most popular examples are around cell phone technology, right? That most African countries were able to leapfrog different levels in those technologies. And then similarly around banking, so mobile, financial systems, those kinds of things. So leapfrogging is definitely possible, but you're right. I think the part around the Asian story that I realized is often undertold. It feels to me as a layperson that there are two pieces that are undertold. The one is the scale of very deliberate investment in those processes. So in the Singapore example, the amount of money and effort tied to research institutions connected to universities, and the very strict requirements for people that came to do production from outside to also invest in innovation and R&D. And that story has been repeated in China. So for example, the way China has built out its high-speed rail networks, it sort of put out to tender large pieces of money, and then those big operators from France, from Canada, part of the deal was that they had to invest in local R&D. So that piece of the Singapore story, I don't think is often told. And the other piece that I think South Africa is really feeling the risks of is the investment in universities and infrastructure and research. So again, places like Singapore, they run a debt to GDP ratio of that's really high. South Africa has like 60% debt to GDP. And the way that they structure that debt is they invested in the research that's required. Where South Africa, in a way, hit pause around the big research and development spending in certain sectors over the last 10 or 15 years, and we're finding it very hard now to catch up. So yeah, there don't seem to be very particularly easy answers around that.
Yeah, so I can add to that. And actually, when I was studying the rise of Africa, James shown one of the slides, the increase in GDP, which happened basically in the first decade of the 21st century. I started to think actually exactly about this question, whether it wouldn't be possible to actually shift this international division of labor from East Asia to Africa, or from East Asia to Sub-Saharan Africa or East Africa. So, so it was my consideration for a long time. Actually, even I put it in some of my papers, this possibility. But how I see this particular catching up in East Asia is that I don't see it as individual success of any of those countries, whether it's Taiwan or South Korea or Singapore, but I see it collectively. So what has happened from my point of view was that actually with, as you mentioned, Curtis, the countries were looking into industrialization, into moving up the value chain. But how this happened? It happened that from Japan till South Korea, Hong Kong, actually the companies were shifting their production. So with increase of industrialization of Japan and South Korea, Hong Kong, Singapore, they were starting to look for a cheaper base for their production. So that's how they were shifting the textile to countries of lower level of development. And at the same time, they were moving into production of higher value added. With what was important factor was the planning, what James said, like Singapore, for example. They had this planning ahead to let's say, put a lot of or higher share of research and development in certain industries or innovation. So at the same time, the whole region of East Asia has been moving into higher level of industrialization and higher level of development and innovation. If you look, for example, at a complexity index, which is showing the innovation, the one by Professor Ricardo Hausmann of Harvard CID, you see that there are all those countries like Japan, South Korea, and now China. So for me, what is really interesting that build really functional integration in that very region. And what is even more important, it didn't exclude less developed countries. So if you look now, it's really impressive industrialization and growth of Vietnam, but also this production is shifting to Cambodia or Myanmar. So this is also called flying geese model of development. So the whole region is moving into higher level of industrialization, and there are different engines. So the first was Japan, but then there were different countries which were like, you know, going into that picture. And for innovation, this very important aspect for East Asia was a planning, which I don't see in many countries. And with innovation, I think countries are in a better position now because probably they can take from this shelf of global innovation right now more easily than just moving through their productivity curve right now. So yeah.
Yeah, I think also the one thing that I also surprised me in the way the story is sometimes told. So to take China, for example, you know, the strength of its ability to plan and you know, make certain bets centrally, you know. Again, through the innovation lens, the story that's often not told is China's appetite for innovation on the policy front, you know. So you know, China will push through at regional, at city, at national level, you know, massive complex pieces of legislation around incentives, around economic zones, around, you know, whatever it might be. And many of them fail, but its appetite to do that is so much higher than ours. So, for example, this idea around industrial development zones, I mean, there are different, you know, pros and cons to them. But, you know, Johannesburg has been talking about creating one for 20 years. You know, we finally, you know, got one up and running about 3 years ago. So we just talked about it. And it's an area around the airport. There's specific incentives that you can get. You can basically import manufacturing equipment, and you can get subsidies, et cetera, And the original intention was actually around beneficialization of minerals, you know, diamonds and that kind of stuff. But actually its biggest tenants, funnily enough, are not who they expected it to be. It has some of the world's biggest single roof cold storage facilities, for example, because there's this whole logistics network into you know, growing middle class economies in the rest of Africa. You know, so there are all these kind of other side effects, but just that appetite to try things, Africa really needs to do more of. The example of Vietnam as well, you know, some people tell that story in a way that Vietnam also has a high appetite for risk and innovation. And it does copy, in inverted commas, what China does, but it tries to do things. It tries to pick up what works, and it tries. Where we seem to move far too slowly. And this COVID response is a really fascinating example of exactly that. You know, the rate at which the South African government has been able to respond and move has been quite staggering, you know, in terms of policies, in terms of resources, in terms of, you know, decision making. You know, it's really surprised us at how quickly it's been able to move. And the city hasn't been able to do that. We talk about a developmental state, but we don't act it, you know? We don't actually try to develop it.
And so this next question kind of in an adjacent way relates to that very thing, the kind of distribution of power between the different levels, national, municipal, and regional. So, you know, in order for African cities and megacities to become innovation ecosystems, they'll need a ton of public investments, and you guys talked about this a bit in the paper. Things like infrastructure, transportation networks, they cost a ton of money, right? But African cities, they often lack the ability to raise, you know, a significant amount of revenue, because most of the taxing powers, they're reserved at the regional or the national level. So with that, how do African cities effectively deal with this problem, especially in instances where different political parties are in power at those different levels or tiers of government?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, Johannesburg in some ways, and it comes a little bit back to the story about debt and government investment. So the city of Johannesburg, post-apartheid, was effectively bankrupt. And then when what is now, they call it the Johannesburg Megacity, when the metropolitan area was created, it was bankrupt and it had significant apartheid debt. So it basically put itself into a self-enforced period of austerity. You know, the city of Johannesburg spent about 10 years grossly underinvesting in its own infrastructure because it had to pay off apartheid debt. And at the same time, it had to try and play catch up and service a much bigger population, you know. And then also after apartheid, the city also more than doubled in size, mostly unemployed and formerly unemployable people, you know, who moved into the cities. But after a period of stabilization in the sort of early 2000s, South Africa always had this narrative that we would pay off apartheid debt, we would sort of stabilize our economy, maybe neoliberalism oversold a little bit, but we would follow that route, which we did. And the theory was always that would lead to a period of sustained investment from like 2006-ish. And that's exactly when the financial crisis hit us, you know, so we ended up not investing. So the city of Joburg has done a few things that are worth talking about. One, it does issue its own bonds, and it is allowed to. There are very few African municipalities that are able to like issue its own bonds. It is able to take on its own debt, and it has its own credit rating. So to all the points that you're talking about. So the city of Johannesburg has been quite innovative around that kind of stuff. And then it also has a big infrastructure plan called Corridors of Freedom, where it's trying to use the levers that it does have, you know, which are physical, around zoning and that kind of stuff, to try and generate more revenue and impact. There's interesting in South Africa, it took a long time. So South African cities were basically operating under apartheid planning legislation up until about 3 or 4 years ago, strangely enough. And there's a new, it's called SPLUMA, I don't know what it stands for. It's a spatial planning, you know, piece of legislation that is supposed to allow for all the kind of innovation and stuff that you're talking about, and free up, you know, how the cities can raise money. But again, South Africa's problem is we can do it brilliantly on paper, but it took us 15 years to do it. You know, where China was pushing it through, responding. You know, so I feel like in a way, and Professor Juma would probably say, what we can leapfrog around. So take Uber as the example. You know, once a technology like Uber comes into play, you don't necessarily need to regulate it in the same way you had to regulate taxis. I mean, that's a famous story, right? So there are probably lots of other things where African cities are trying to regulate in an old way, and we could potentially leapfrog some of the legislation and regulation by using technologies and that kind of thing that would allow for innovation. But how you actually do that, I think, is tough, obviously.
Mm-hmm. And so last questions, just checking the time here. This is more of a high level question, so feel free to speculate. I won't hold you to it. So Stephen Redelet, he's a former chief economist at USAID and now a professor, I believe, at Georgetown, and a few others have really pushed this Africa Rising narrative over the past 2 or 3 decades. And you guys kind of showed, over the past decade, especially, African GDP has been increasing. There have been a lot of progress there. Does this optimistic picture of the continent still hold in the post-COVID world? I'll put it for maybe first Kat, and then James can finish off.
So yes, great question, and it's very interesting, this narrative. So I want to go back to 2000 in this changing narrative where the economists called Africa the hopeless continent, and 10 years later it was the Africa Rising narrative. So it's extremely interesting. But after this really increase in the dynamics in Africa, we already saw the decrease in GDP. And unfortunately, I think this shows not sustainability and volatility of many of African economies. And regarding to the COVID-19, I think we all agree that the global south and developing countries will be mostly affected by the situation from many reasons. So I would put a few things for African megacities, and if you put together, first of all, the population boom we've showed on a slide. When we add to this the density, and if you take, for example, Dhaka, 40,000 people per square kilometers, not only megacity, take Mogadishu, and despite that density is really in the heart of creativity and in innovations, at the same time, the denser the population is, the faster the virus spread. It's quite obvious. And the third thing, if we add to that the poverty, which James already mentioned, like 60% or 80% of urban population live in slums in so many African cities. And if you add to that the last element, which is the different quality of healthcare system, like one hospital bed per 10,000 people, and put on the COVID-19, actually the picture is really not optimistic at all, and we can say it's really a huge threat and global threat. So developmental threat not only for Africa, not only for African cities, but for the global community. But as a born optimist, I'm optimistic. So despite this really negative picture, I'm very optimistic. And I actually believe that this situation will add room for adaptation, readaptation, readjustment of cities and restructuring of the cities, including in African context. But we must, and the governments, the municipalities need to do it wisely. So I will just point into 2 directions to do it. And I would say it must be do it in a sustainable way. So sustainability must be included in that, the first thing, and then inclusiveness.
Mm-hmm.
Sure. Yeah, a few things came to mind. The one more hopeful one, I think, is the realization that there is real value in digital technology, and there's a real sort of feeling, I think, a sort of a reconnection. So there was this hope that the digital divide could be broken, and I think instead what people have found, that there's actually been an acceleration of separation, where places like Silicon Valley are accelerating away. But I think now during COVID, this realization that you can use technologies to work directly with people, I think is really quite powerful. And I think they're hopefully using that. There can be lots of other ways to try and think about, there's some real leapfrog opportunities, right? So like if the last 40 years or 30 years of economic growth was driven in the financial sector. And then the next 20 years of economic growth is going to be driven by this explosion in data, for example. There's lots of opportunity there for, for African entrepreneurs, for young people, to learn those kinds of skills. And as bandwidth and stuff gets cheaper, they can engage in that global economy, and there's also a little more philosophical, but there's a Steve Biko quote, the South African activist and writer in the 60s. He said, the West's great gift to the world was a military and industrial look, and Africa's great gift to the world is going to be a more human face. So it kind of plays in this idea of relationships, And if you look at all the stuff around the fourth industrial revolution, how to future-proof ourselves, creativity, communication, critical thinking, it's all about leveraging those human skills, right? And then the other really exciting thing that people underestimate with this exponential change in the fourth industrial revolution is price is also dropping. Things that were bespoke and expensive are becoming platforms. The prices are dropping hugely, so there are big opportunities. And the last one is just one that Professor Juma often spoke about, is the power of innovation in agriculture. So to use agriculture potentially and food supply as a platform for innovation, because it's relatively easy to engage young people, it's relatively easy to engage around cities, and then basically you create a space for people to learn how to communicate, how to innovate, how to come up with things. So the kind of meshing between feeding people in African cities and using technology around supply chains was something he was always very excited about, and thought universities and researchers and industry should focus more on. And I think post-COVID, there's going to be lots of focus on those human service things, right? Health, food, and there should be value, education. There should be value in all those things, I think.
Great. Well, thanks again, guys. But so lastly, if folks watch this and are interested in learning a little more, asking a few questions of either of you, website or Twitter, what's the best way to get in touch with either of you? Maybe Kat for your book, or James for Tomorrow Trust. I'll put it to you, Kat, and then James.
So LinkedIn and Twitter or email, all fine.
Okay.
Or
we'll link to that in the video description.
Yeah.
James?
Sure.
Yeah, same thing. You can find me on LinkedIn. I think James Donald was a famous actor at some point, but there aren't that many South African James Donalds. And my email can be in the connection, yeah.
Great. Okay. Well, that's all the questions I had. As I said at the beginning, I'm Curtis Lockhart. I'm a researcher at the Charter Cities Institute. You can learn more about CCI's work at www.chartercitiesinstitute.org. Subscribe to our YouTube channel where this video is going to be posted, or follow us on Twitter at cci.city. With that, thanks so much, Kat and James. You guys both have a good one and stay safe.